Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome to On the Middle East, Al Monitor's podcast on the big and interesting stories in the region. My name is Ambryn Zaman, and today I'll be discussing the mass protests in Turkey that erupted on March 19 after the opposition mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem Imamoglu, was arrested on corruption and terrorism charges. Imamoglu and his main opposition Republican People's Party insist the charges are all politically motivated and that President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's aim is to clear his own path to a third presidential term by eliminating his most threatening rival. With me here today to discuss what this means for the future of Turkey's democracy, or what's left of it, are Gonul, the director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program, and Lisel, Hintz, an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University of Advanced International Studies, who is a leading expert on Turkey. Welcome to our program, Gonul. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me, Ambryn.
You wrote this extremely important and striking article for Foreign Affairs saying that with the arrest of Ekrem Imamoglu, Turkey has moved decisively from competitive authoritarianism to an authoritarian regime. Can you unpack that for our audience? What did you actually mean when you said that?
Sure. Until now, Turkey has been defined by political scientists as a competitive authoritarian regime. It is competitive because we still have elections. There are political parties, they're not underground, and the opposition can compete in the elections by fielding their own candidate. So it is the electoral competition is very much real. But it's authoritarian because Erdogan controls everything from media to courts and bureaucratic institutions, and he has transformed the playing field so much in his favor that political competition is not fair. So this is to say, competitive authoritarianism is a regime in which electoral competition is real, but it's unfair. But with this move, with arresting Imamoglu, his top political rival, Erdogan has taken a huge step towards turning Turkey into a Putin-style autocracy. Now, what is the difference? The difference is just look at Russian elections last year. No real candidate who had a real chance at beating Putin at the ballot box was allowed to run. Basically, Putin handpicked his own opponents, and that is the direction that we're going in Turkey. We're not there yet. We have to remind the viewers, we're not there yet, but this is what Erdogan has in mind. The big question now to understand whether Turkey will become a Russia-style autocracy, it all hinges on what will happen to the popular protests that have the people taken to the streets. If Erdogan responds with greater police violence and if the protests die down, Erdogan will keep Imamoglu in jail, and that will be just another step towards that goal. But an opposite can also happen. If the protests continue with the same intensity that we've seen in the last few days, and if this further undermines Turkey's economy, this could very much undermine further Erdogan's popular support. And that means that the democratic reflex will have dealt a huge blow to what Erdogan has in mind in terms of the country's future.
But there's another darker scenario where Erdogan feels desperate enough that he declares a state of emergency or martial law. Do you think that that's on the cards?
It could very well be, because we're talking about a regime that is desperate. Erdogan understands that he's lost so much ground. His popular support has been waning for some time. And he understands that if there's a popular opponent like Imamoglu, he may very well lose at the ballot box. So that is a real prospect there. So he could very well take a step to make sure that doesn't happen, to suppress dissent. But again, what Erdogan has in mind may be becoming Putin, but Turkey is not Russia, right? Turkey has this very strong culture. Turks love their ballot box. They love voting in the elections. And that's one of the reasons why, unlike 2013 Gezi protests, the protests that are taking place right now have a much broader appeal. A lot of people think that this is legitimate. Unlike I'm not suggesting the Gezi protests were not legitimate, but that's how Erdogan was able to frame them, as the movement of a youth fringe group. But this time, these people are fighting for the future democracy of the country, and it has a broader support among people.
Why is Imamoglu so threatening to Erdogan?
Well, because Imamoglu is, in many ways, just like Erdogan, right? He manages to cultivate this special bond between his supporters. I mean, if you ever accompany him on his trip across the country, the way he speaks with people, the way he communicates with people, the personal chemistry, it's very strong, just like Erdogan's has been. And also, another threatening aspect of Imamoglu is the fact that Imamoglu is not a typical CHP candidate who is only appealing to a very narrow secularist audience. Imamoglu is someone who has the potential to draw votes from not just secularists, but Turks, Kurds, conservatives, liberals, and that's why he's very threatening.
And one reason, obviously, that he was successful was also because he received Kurdish support. And one of the goals of Erdogan is to drive a wedge between the CHP and the Kurds. And that's one reason he started this new initiative where he's talking to Öcalan and talking about ending the PKK insurgency, etc. But we all know what he really wants is to get the Kurds to support him so he can run for a third time, which is currently not allowed under the Turkish constitution. Where do the Kurds stand? How are they handling this moment?
Well, this is an inflection point for them too, and it's a very difficult moment for the Kurds too, because on the one hand, they think that they are on the verge of an historic agreement where the PKK will lay down arms and the Kurds will receive something in return. So that's why, from the very beginning, the pro-Kurdish party representatives and some of their constituency, I presume, have wholeheartedly supported Erdogan's talks with Abdullah Öcalan, right? And you cannot really blame them for trying to put an end to a 40-year insurgency after so much destruction and death. But on the other hand, this is a very difficult moment for them, because for many years, the pro-Kurdish party have really supported the country's democratic consolidation. And now they are seen by some in the opposition as cooperating with Erdogan to consolidate his autocracy. So that's a very difficult spot to be in for them. So they have to decide that, do they really believe that an increasingly autocratic leader will deliver them long fought rights and democracy? And that's a difficult question to answer, maybe, if you look at it from pro-Kurdish party representatives. But if you ask the hundreds of thousands of people who have taken to the streets, there is a very straightforward answer. You cannot expect Erdogan to provide a democratic opening when his police are torturing people simply because they want to keep their right to elect and to be elected. So it is, I think, an inflection point for the Kurdish political movement as well.
And a very tricky moment, as you say, also because let's say they were to join the protests, that would probably make the dark scenario that we conjured earlier even more likely, that Erdogan would then maybe really press the nuclear button and declare a state of emergency, concoct some kind of national security, a crisis in order to justify that. One final question. You're sitting in Washington where the Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan is, and Erdogan is expected to meet with Trump sometime soon, I guess. He's there to lay the ground for that meeting. What is the US position on these protests? Does the Trump administration have anything to say to Turkey about the way it's treating its citizens?
None. And this is according to people who were involved in the discussions in the meeting between Secretary Marco Rubio and Hakan Fidan. According to the people that I talked to, it was Hakan Fidan who preemptively raised the protests and Imamoglu's arrest, and Marco Rubio said in response that they had their own house to put in order. And after the meeting, in the statement, they put a sentence there saying that they are concerned about what was happening in Turkey, but that was not really something that was discussed with Hakan Fidan, which is not surprising, really, Amberin. I mean, we're talking about President Trump, who is too busy undermining American democracy to say anything to foreign autocrats who are suppressing their own people's democratic demands.
Well, on that depressing note, my dear Gonul, thank you so much for joining us today. And good luck with all those other interviews. Everybody wants to talk to you, so we feel very lucky that you spared the time to talk to us.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Amberin, and you guys are doing a great job covering what's on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25, for a discount.
So welcome to our program, Lisel. It's so good to have you with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So Lisel, can you talk to us a little bit about how the government is pushing back against the opposition narrative?
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand first the extent to which the government has a wide variety of media tools to be able to push back. So the fact that it controls so much of radio, television, and newsprint coverage is essential in ensuring that their narrative becomes dominant. And their narrative is one of state terror. The way in which the government is reacting to these protests, both by university students on university campuses, which we know are ongoing, as well as the rallies that the CHP led in front of Saraçhane and how those have diffused to other areas, is that this is a threat to national security. This is not only violation of the ban on protests that the government put in place, but that this is an absolute security threat. This is terrorism. This is street terror. And what that does is that it enables the government to criminalize peaceful protest, to criminalize people showing up and expressing their dissent against this particular power grab. And this is not a new tactic by any means.
Yeah, we saw them resort to, I mean, the most crazy, I would say, propaganda during the Gezi protests, particularly that claim leaps to mind of protesters going into this mosque and drinking in the mosque and urinating it and all kinds of horrible things that the government claimed they did, only for the imam of the mosque to come out and say, actually, none of that happened. And we're seeing a replay of that. Can you speak to a bit to those smear tactics beyond the terrorism claim?
Absolutely. So I think what's really important, again, is kind of shaping narratives and not only providing the legal groundwork for the government to enact harsh punishments against these individuals. That's the criminalization part. But the other part is to delegitimize them in the eyes of viewers, listeners, readers, anyone who is consuming this pro-government media. And so I write a lot about vilification tactics and the way in which ruling parties are able to use particularly culturally sensitive frames and words that delegitimize these protesters, that make them seem like nuisances, like criminals, like terrorists, like immoral people, right? And so that point that you made about the mosque, I think, is really important. During the Gezi Park protests, there were two main claims that the government repeated over and over, and by the way, continues to, like at parliamentary group meetings, Erdogan continues to, or at and in all of his public speeches, Erdogan continues to repeat these claims. And one was, exactly as you said, that during the Gezi Park protests, protesters broke into a mosque and they were drinking and they threw beer cans around and they had group sex and they were just desecrating the mosque. Think of like a villain in a horror movie. Everything you could imagine, right, is what they are saying these individuals did. And precisely as you said, the imam of that mosque literally said, not only were they incredibly respectful and none of this happened, they took off their shoes before they came into the mosque. So imagine fleeing tear gas and taking the time to take off your shoes to show respect to the mosque, right? So that's one. And then the second was that there was a headscarfed woman with a baby carriage and that she was trying to board the ferry. And while waiting there, these, bare-chested, balaclava-clad men, again, picture, the most scary, frightening image from a horror movie, beat her, swear at her, urinate on her, all these kinds of things while she has this baby carriage. So if you think about, again, for a conservative society that's been reared in patriarchal norms, the idea of attacking a headscarfed woman with a baby carriage is like the worst thing you could possibly do. Again, completely false. The camera footage shows that didn't happen. So they're using these very, very visceral frames to say, look how horrible, how immoral these individuals are. They deserve all the punishment that they can get, first. And second, their grievances aren't valid, right? Nothing that they are saying about the government is valid because these are immoral people that also, by the way, are probably sponsored by Western agents. So there's like this nefarious external saboteur frame that they kind of try to insert there as well. We saw something almost identical in this past week's protests, which was a government claim that protesters were urinating on a mosque. They were throwing beer cans, the mosque right across from Saraçhane, across from the municipality office. And it's blatantly false. But what that does is that you then get a group of individuals who kind of rally around that. And so you had, a group of young men who rallied and we're shouting chants and we're saying, in the name of Islam, this is horrible and we're not going to allow this, all that kind of stuff. So it delegitimizes protesters in the government, in the audience's eyes. It allows the government to criminalize them, and it rallies counter protesters that then can kind of police those who've showed up in peaceful demonstration.
Except that one gets the sense that this isn't flying this time. And when you look at the crowds, I mean, there's a very diverse bunch of people. Obviously, it's students who are leading the protests. But for example, when you had that primary where everybody went to vote for the CHP's presidential candidate, CHP claims up to 15 million showed up. I don't know how you independently verify that, but very clearly it wasn't your traditional secular, so-called white Turks showing up, right? You had ladies in headscarves and all kinds of people who you would imagine vote for Erdogan. So, do you think that the government is going to be able to shape the narrative in the way it wants and have people actually believe this stuff this time? I mean, we just saw them take Halk TV, the main opposition channel, off the air for 10 days. So clearly they're feeling the heat. They booted out the BBC correspondent. They,
Mark Lowen,
yeah, briefly jailed up to, I think it was 9 or 10 journalists, including AFP correspondents. So things don't seem to be going quite their way. What do you say to that, Lisel?
So, first of all, I think it was a brilliant move by the opposition party to say we would like those who are not even members of our party to show up and cast a solidarity vote. So that's exactly what you're talking about, kind of this broad base of support. And I also think it was brilliant because there was a swath of individuals that A, might not have voted for the CHP, but B, probably wouldn't have shown up to a protest or a march, right? Like elderly individuals, people in wheelchairs. We saw images of people carrying people on their backs, getting them to the polls. They're not going to show up for a protest, probably, but they will show up to vote, right? They will show up to ensure that they can cast their voice, they can use their voice in pushing back against this power grab again. So I think that was really smart. And it is that wider swath than just the typical CHP base. In terms of how much people are buying this, it's so difficult to tell. It is so much easier to kind of trace the content of what the government is saying and the channels that they're using to disseminate that narrative than it is to sort of see how people are responding to it. I think you're right to point to Rütük's, broadcasting ban, temporary broadcasting ban on Halk TV. We also saw punishments against Sözcü, against Now, formerly known as Fox. So this is the sign of a government that is worried, that is very, very concerned about controlling the channels of information dissemination as tightly as possible. Rütük had initially said, please don't they probably didn't use please, don't broadcast, Özgür Özel, main opposition leaders' speeches, right? Lots and lots of regulations are in place on social media, right? There's the disinformation law. There's already insulting the president law. There's data localization laws, which makes it easier to make content takedown requests. So there's all of these like legal frameworks that are in place to try to control information dissemination. And still they're making new steps or taking new steps in order to try to constrict that space even further. The only thing that I will say in terms of is it working or isn't it? Because again, I think it's really tough to know at this point. I think we can use different methods to find that out later. Is almost in a sense, it doesn't matter so much. There are so many authoritarian governments that kind of function by as if. It's like people behave as if they believe the media. Scholars like Lisa Wedeen and others have written really, really fascinating stuff on this. And it's like you sort of go along with the government narrative, whether you genuinely believe it or not, because you want to avoid punishment and it just makes your life easier. And so there are lots of individuals that are kind of willing to buy into this. Some will genuinely believe it, and in part because this, these horrifying false but horrifying images sort of resonate with them. And so that's going to rally his base. But for those who are sort of on the margins, I think that the culture of self-censorship that has been cultivated by all of these media crackdowns kind of leads individuals to just go along with it and behave as if they sort of believe what these narratives are saying, or at least not to publicly contest them because they see that there's a tremendous cost for doing so.
That's very depressing, but then in normal circumstances, they'd be able to express their true feelings at the ballot box. And that now seems to be in question. One final point, you mentioned Erdogan's base, and he is kind of a messianic figure for some Turks, isn't he? He's managed to sort of create a cult, if you will, of people who almost worship him. Do you think that's been affected by any of this? Is that kind of showing cracks, or is he firmly in control of what people sometimes say is around 20% of the electorate? I don't know. It's a figure that you often hear bandied about.
So I think this gets at precisely this. So there are those who are his core base. And I think it's so important to understand that cultish nature of his following. The race, right? He's the captain. He's our leader. People, I think, very much see him as not just the leader of Turkey, but leader of the Muslim world, also leader of the global South writ large. Like if you look at the government's messaging tools, in addition to all the state control and then the crony capitalism that leads them to be able to control the private channels as well, there's also government produced media. And if you look at like the videos that they've been disseminating on all of the institutional channels, they are very much cultivating this personality cult. They are linking Erdogan with the people and then linking him with the regime and then linking him with the regime's accomplishments in these glorified videos of how incredible he is and how many things he's built and how he stood up to Muslims all over the world. Like it's a coordinated campaign to create a personality cult. And I think that resonates with a lot of individuals who have bought into his at times victimization tinged narrative for a long time, right? That he was someone who was jailed for being a pious Muslim, for a poem that he read when he was mayor of Istanbul. And now he represents all of those who were oppressed by the secularist regime, by military tutelage and all that kind of stuff. So I think that resonates tremendously with those individuals. But then again, and this is where those cracks, as you said, come in. There are those who showed up at that solidarity rally, solidarity vote opportunity on Sunday saying, I usually vote AKP, but I can't stand this. This is a red line, and messing with democracy and the integrity of elections is a red line. And I think that is something that is maybe not unique to Turkey's society, but is very characteristic of it, that polls matter, voting matters. People care about elections. They show up and they are deeply, deeply invested in the consequences. So I think there is a section, again, quantifying it is tough, but there's a section that will believe in him, believe that no matter what he does, it's okay, it's justified. After the 2013 corruption trials, there were those who said, oh, maybe there was some corruption, but it's him and he's leading the country and that's okay. So there's an excusability, I guess, that some will lend, but for others, this is a red line. And I think we saw that even with the rerun of the local elections in 2019, when Imamoglu won with a margin the first time, they annul it. He runs again, he wins with a lot more votes. So I think we see this consistently in Turkey. So I do think the cult of personality is important, but it doesn't hold for everyone. And so figuring out what that margin is and where the tipping point is and where people stop pretending that they believe and they reveal their preferences and they show up and they say no more, that's tough to qualify and calculate in advance. Timur Kuran, a Turkish economist, has written fantastic stuff about this on preference falsification and where's the tipping point. And often we can only find out afterwards. But I think the lesson is to be encouraged, to know that even if it seems like everybody is sort of going along with the regime, even if it seems like there's no hope, there can be a break. There can be something that happens. It could be that elites defect. It could be that the security forces are no longer willing to use force against protesters. There's different cracks and shifts that can happen that then all of those preferences that have been kind of hidden show up and people show up and then revolutions can happen.
Well, on that hopeful note, we'll end this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, Lisel.
Thank you so much. It's always a privilege.
And this brings us to the end of this week's episode of On the Middle East. For more in-depth coverage on the Turkey protests and much more, go to our website, www.al-monitor.com. Thank you and goodbye.